we were talking about evolutionary psychology and the explanations for mate preferences and selecting a mate. And I didn't show you the experiment where they did the mate pairing experiment. I didn't show you that, right? So the people in the study were wearing those unitards, and then there's one section where they put their hair back in caps so that you can't really see anything, because this is like advertisement, right? That some kind of feminine trait, and like my adornments, right? So they put their hair back and so that you can't really see any of that, and then they arbitrarily assign the 10 men and the 10 women a number from 1 to 10, and they put it on their head. And so it's like that game where you don't know what your number is. And then they mill around the room, and the goal is to get the highest number, so to score the perfect 10. Well, you don't know what your number is, but you can see everybody else's number. So as people are milling around the room, obviously everybody's going to go for the 10s first. And so you quickly find out that, whether you have a high or a low number based on if people are like walking away from you or not. So like say you're the 10 and mine is a 2, but I don't know what my number is. So I've come up to you to try to pair off with you. You see my low number, you're going to not accept my hand, and you're going to go off to someone with a higher number. So then I get shut down, and then I'll go on to the next one. Maybe yours is a 7, and I'll go, okay, well, the 9 and the 8, I don't see them, and they're already pairing off, and so I try for you, and you go, 2, no, not good, I can do better than that, and so I get rejected again, and now I come over here, and let's say yours is a 4, but you've already also been rejected by the female 10, 9, 8, and you see mine, and you go, 2. Ooh, but you've been rejected, and so we pair off. So kind of what ends up happening is the end of this very quick experiment, the 10 pairs almost absolutely pair off by their correct numbers. Like, it's pretty fascinating. So then in real life, do we kind of do that? I mean, by the time you're about 13 or 14 years old, you kind of know your level of attractiveness based on how much attention you've been getting and how much rejection you've gotten. So kids will kind of start to figure this out. It depends on where you live and what your peer group is, but that's kind of how you figure out where you fall. And people actually do pair up with people who are about the same level of attractiveness, but then they'll also trade for traits, right? So more attractive women will often pair up with less attractive men because they have other things to offer, other qualities to offer, like the security or being really intelligent, ambitious, all those things that maybe you can be looking for in a mate. When they did these studies worldwide, this is sampling 37 cultures, okay, so it's not like, every culture of the world, but it's from every continent, right? We have a huge variety. We're looking at individualistic cultures versus collectivistic cultures, which vary significantly, yet we still get this pretty dominant preference of males looking for younger females and females looking for older, more mature, ambitious, stable males. So that's where the evolutionary psychologist likes to apply that this has been something that's kind of followed us through time. It's been passed on through natural selection that we continue to look for these things in order to have reproductive success. So now let's critique the evolutionary psychology theory as it applies to mating and sexuality in general. How can we critique it? Because we definitely can, right? Yeah?
Well, so far it would only apply to heterosexuals because it's all about mating.
Okay, so if it's all about mating, then this doesn't apply to anyone except heterosexuals. But aren't there an awful lot of heterosexuals who don't care to procreate? Right? Not everybody wants to have children, and they're still very much heterosexual, so it doesn't explain all of those people. or maybe you physically can't, you have something in reproductive system or whatever, but that doesn't mean that you aren't still sexual, right? Right? How else can we critique it? Come on. You love it? It's a perfect theory. Yeah, Athena?
Looking at the map, it looks like it's mainly European-dominated countries or countries that have been invaded by England.
So it's a real Western influence.
I see nothing in Russia or northern Africa or the eastern side where Brazil is.
Yeah, I don't know why they didn't sample. This sample is just 37 cultures.
It's very much where Caesar Augustus went.
Yeah, so the colonization. The thing is, though, if we were to sample other parts of Africa and Asia and India, South America, which are more collectivistic cultures, we would actually find similar results. This study just happened to only look at 37 cultures. And actually, they find that the more inequality you have between the genders in whatever said culture is being studied, these things come out even more. So if you have a more egalitarian society, then we don't see this as much. So it's kind of interesting that maybe the ethnographer or whoever did this study chose some of those areas like Western Europe, because Western Europe, especially like the northern part of Europe, tends to have more egalitarian societies, and so we see less disparity between the genders, yet they're still coming up with the same result. Okay, what other critiques on evolution theory here? Yeah, another one.
It kind of applies that we don't have a conscious choice. It's like all of these subconscious things are controlling everything.
Yeah, I mean, it really kind of undermines morality, doesn't it? It sort of undermines our ability to make a choice and have free will and be guided by our own decisions. That it's like it's in your DNA to like behave like an animal, and so it's not really crediting that we do have free will, we do have choices, we do have morality, and not everybody wants to procreate. You've got to be cautious of the hindsight bias. We're looking at behavior today, looking backwards, and coming up with some kind of hypothesis as to why people have these similarities that are global similarities. So you could be falling into that dangerous zone of the hindsight bias, that's the I knew it all along phenomenon, and it's not really applying the scientific method. So while it may be very interesting and intriguing, it's still just really a hypothesis. And then it undercuts morality and the influence of culture, and if we take sort of the element of culture and maybe combine it with the evolutionary perspective, then maybe it has a better hypothesis, has a stronger hypothesis. But when we see more equal societies where men and women are treated and valued equally, we see less of these disparities between gender preferences. So, but it's still kind of fun to talk about, and maybe can explain, why people kind of do these different patterns. But we got to remember that culture is a huge component in all of that piece of the puzzle. So let's kind of move on now more towards sexuality. And this will be my plug today. You guys are registering for classes in another week, right? For spring quarter, another week and a half or so. Kind of depends on your registration date. And human sexuality is a class offered next quarter. You get to see or better in this class, which hopefully you will. And you can take human sexuality, and it's a diversity course, so it can count as your diversity credit, and it's a list day elective. And we talk about gender for a whole week. We talk about sexual orientation for a whole week. And of course, we talk about all the body parts and stuff, and this is just really an introduction to sexual motivation and behavior. So if you find it interesting, then maybe take that class. Okay, so sexual motivation, this is obviously got to be something driving an impulse, something from your brain that's encouraging you to go out and seek partners or be sexual. But sexual reproduction is only necessary for the survival of the species, and that would be for any species, right? But it's not necessary for our individual survival. Like you could live a solitary life, not create relationships with other people, or you could create lots of friendships with other people and not be sexual and live a long, healthy life. So then we find this in higher level organisms. Lower level organisms really seem to be driven by instinct, right? Are we driven by instinct to reproduce? I mean, it's kind of a weird question because, if you get into a relationship or even if you're not in a relationship, there's something that's like, you're like, why do we have this desire to have a baby? I mean, who here would like to have a baby someday, would like to be a dad or a mom? Raise your hand. Okay? And you're like, where does that come from? Why would I want to be responsible for another person's life? That's huge. Yet we have something like this sort of like inner desire to do it. Lower level animals have these hormonal shifts that is instinctual, and they will only be sexual when they have that chance to reproduce. And so that period is called estrus. So we're talking about mammals, right? So mammals that are going through estrus, that means that the female is able to, be fertilized, able to have babies. So, but humans, we're not like that, right? In fact, we often avoid the fertile window. If you don't want to get pregnant, you avoid those 2 days, like if you're doing a counting method, which is not a real reliable method of birth control. Or we'll use double protection during your fertile window. But there are animals, lower level animals, that can detect this not only in the behavior of the animal, but in the scents that they release in the peptides in their urine. So these are little, like field mice. They're called prairie voles. And the prairie vole, they live in the plain states, like in the United States, like Midwest and Montana, Dakotas, that region. And the prairie voles will mate up during estrus. The male actually releases a hormone in his urine. And this is the female down below, and she's sniffing him. She's checking out she's smelling his urine to see if he's a suitable mate. And if she thinks he's a suitable mate, she will present herself through that little lordosis where they lift their rump. And a lot of mammals do that. If you've ever had a cat or a dog that's not neutered or spayed, they'll do that, right? They'll lift their rump, get down on short legs. That's what we used to say when the cat was in heat. We'd be like, oh my God, shut the door, shut the door. She's rearing up. She's ready, right? So these animals will check for compatibility, and then after they mate and then they have their litter, they actually stay together for life. There are several different species found in the world that are monogamous. Now, granted, their life might only be 4 or 5 years long, the most, so you think, oh, that's like really hard commitment, right? But they do mate for life. So it's interesting. There's a chemical thing that happens in their brain, and they've studied that, and they're trying to compare that. Maybe, does this translate to humans in any way? Well, okay, first of all, we don't go around sniffing each other, or do we? Do we sniff each other? So there's scent, like, you can put scent on you, like your, perfumes and your Axe spray, boom chicka, whatever it was, the boom chicka wow wow, spray the Axe spray. Okay, that's something that you're spraying on yourself to smell good or get rid of your body odor. But then sometimes people will be attracted to certain natural body odor, not BO like stinko, but like someone's individual actual scent. But really what we're talking about is pheromones, and we can't really detect that. We can't absolutely smell pheromones in the air. But it's subtle, and maybe people are sort of picking up on it. Females' menstrual cycle, if it's totally regular and all your hormone sequences are in the right order, and a lot of women don't have regular cycles, you may not be absolutely certain if you're ovulating. If you're trying to get pregnant and you're reading books and you're learning what the signs of ovulation are, you'll start to figure it out. But often young girls and young women have real irregular cycles, and you don't really know yourself when you're ovulating. So how can a man possibly know, who's just walking around and, even someone that you're living with, how could they possibly know that you're ovulating? So maybe it's a very subtle thing. So sex researchers have done this famous study called the sweaty T-shirt study. You read about it? Have you read about the sweaty T-shirt study? It's been done several different ways. And what they do essentially is they have first they have to make sure everybody's heterosexual. That's important to differentiate. They also want to make sure that the females in this study are not taking hormone birth control pills or patches or shots or anything like that. They're just a natural cycle, whatever their regular hormones are. No artificial hormones given to them. So the guys come into this study. They either get real sweaty on a treadmill, sweat in a shirt, or they'll sleep in a shirt like a couple nights in a row and get it kind of full of their stink. And then they take the shirts in. They take a saliva sample from the men to look at their DNA, and then they bottle up all these stinky shirts, and then they have the female subjects come in. They also take a saliva sample to look at their DNA, and then the women smell the shirts. Lovely, right? Can you imagine being in that state? So they smell the shirts, and then they rate from like 0 to 10 how stinky they think it is. Like if it's really stinky, awful, or if they actually find it kind of appealing or attracted to it. And what they find at the end of the study, and of course this is repeated with lots of different subjects, and it's been repeated in several different universities that have done this sweaty shirt study, they find that there are, most of the time the women say the shirts all stink. But there are occasions where a woman will say one or two of the shirts smells good, or she's even attracted to the smell. And what do you think would be the occasion when a woman would be responding that way rather than just saying? Exactly. So that's why they take the saliva sample and they can measure the hormones and be looking at that. If she is ovulating, one or two of the shirts, she says, smells kind of good. She's kind of like attracted to it, maybe even a little turned on. And then interestingly, some of the other shirts she'll be repulsed by, and even say, this shirt smells so bad it smells like my brother, or it reminds me of my brother. Okay, so we could kind of go back to a little bit of evolutionary theory here. Why would you be disgusted by someone who smells like your brother? Yeah. Yeah, you don't want to mate with people who are too genetically similar to you, because you may have chromosome abnormalities. You have a greater likelihood of a miscarriage or something bad happening, some kind of disorder, something that wouldn't be healthy, wouldn't be successful. Plus, we want to mix up our genes so that we get stronger immune systems. So they also are looking at the saliva samples, and they found that those mates, the one that she was attracted to, not only are they definitely not related, they have like opposite immune systems. So the theory is these people, if they were to hook up and have a baby, that baby would have like a really good immune system response because they'd have a lot of different combinations of genes. You know, I've even heard of like dating services where you said so you know, online dating, except for now you send in your cheek swab sample and get paired and matched up. It's kind of weird, huh? Yeah. And the thing is, they've actually taken couples and done like couples that have been together, you know, 30, 40 years and say that they're still in love, and they sample their DNA and take a look, and they're not always, you know, like the compatible DNA match. So it's really still just a theory, but I think it's still kind of interesting that, you know, maybe there's some kind of subtlety thing going on. Also, there's another study where the men they'll take a photograph of a female every single day, and like very neutral, hair pulled back, no facial expression, and we'll just take a snapshot of her every day of her menstrual cycle. And they'll either put it in a book or they'll have it on the computer. And then the guys come in, and they have to go through it kind of fast, clicking through the pictures, and you rate her level of attractiveness. And lo and behold, the 2 days that she's ovulating in the cycle, she gets rated as being more attractive. It's like, what the heck's going on? Is like your the complexion clear up? Are you like literally glowing? What is it that and that's just in a two-dimensional, you know, photograph. So maybe these things, maybe our hormones and these things are very, very subtle, and you know, guys can be interested in sex at the drop of a hat. Girls get slightly more interested in sex when they're ovulating. Yeah.
I was reading in the book that girls become red in their cheeks when they're ovulating. That's what it says.
Maybe that makes them look healthier and makes them more attractive.
Because it really opens their blood vessels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And their cheeks become more red.
Yeah. I mean, and you have a big peak in estrogen, which an estrogen is really good for collagen and keratin for your hair, so you actually, you know, maybe look healthier and prettier. Who knows, right? Okay, so then we're like, okay, well, let's study other species to see what their sexual behavior is like, what their sexual motivation is like, and we say, okay, it's not just about estrus, even though there may be some subtleties even amongst humans and non-human primates, like these bonobo chimpanzees. It's also sort of a means of communication. And that's how, you know, and in a relationship, you're sort of establishing a relationship, right? So these higher level species, like the bonobo chimpanzees, these are found in the African Congo. And they're the really big ones, really big chimpanzees. They have some sexual behavior that looks pretty human-like. They will copulate face-to-face. You know, most animals the male will just mount the female from behind. They'll copulate face-to-face, like humans. And they kiss. They'll kiss on the mouth, and this is not like some kind of staged photo. They also will have group sex. They also see a lot of homosexual activity. But some of it, when the anthropologists have gone in and observed the chimps, they've found that there seems to be some kind of socializing going on in their behavior. It's not all about procreation. Some of it seems to be like, let's all make nice and get along, or using sex as a means to control and put people in their place. Does that sound anything like humans might behave occasionally? Unfortunately, sex can be used in a very positive, good way, but it also, unfortunately, can be used in this, you know, more aggressive or manipulative way, and that's going males or females. So they see that happening with the chimpanzees, and it seems to be this sort of like social sort of agent that's happening. It's not just about hormones. So humans, obviously, we know humans are having sex all the time, every single minute of the day, all over the world. But prior to, like 60 years ago, people didn't even really know what was happening physiologically in the body. I mean, it's pretty obvious looking at a man who's sexually aroused, you can see it. Everything's exposed, you can see what's going on. But they still didn't even have like all the anatomy. I mean, you're looking at bodies post-mortem. They didn't have the technology, but they really didn't understand what was happening in the sexually aroused female because everything's tucked up inside her body. Plus, in the Victorian era, 19th century, doctors couldn't even examine women. It was like against the law. So nobody even knew what like their bodies really, everything would be post-mortem. And obviously, living tissue is much different than post-mortem, so they didn't really know what was going on here. So we have a couple of researchers that came along. In the 1950s, they were at Indiana University, at Washington University in St. Louis. Yeah, Washington University is in St. Louis. And William Masters was a gynecologist and an obstetrician and a researcher, and he started studying sex because he himself actually didn't have a lot of sexual experience. Yet here he is a gynecologist and practicing medicine, delivering babies, and as couples were coming into him that wanted to get pregnant and having difficulty getting pregnant, he kind of found out right away that the couples themselves had no idea what they were doing. And like lots of misconceptions about sexuality in general. So he started studying it, and then Virginia Johnson was his research assistant, his partner, who he eventually ended up marrying. So they were a husband and wife team then that essentially were groundbreaking sex researchers that charted the physiological response for both males and females. So they recorded over 10,000 orgasms in males and females, most of them through manual masturbation, but some with couples together. But they were really interested in this physiological response, not so much about like the relationship aspect of it. So how do they get this physiological data? I mean, and this was in the 1950s when they started their work. Well, they had some instruments that obviously they had to, invent and figure out how to do this. This is the penile strain gauge. You just imagine it goes around the penis, and what it's going to be doing is measuring the circumference of the penis as the man gets aroused. Blood engorges the organ, and it gets bigger, obviously. And this very sensitive equipment then measures even the most subtle changes at all in blood flow. Today they have even better inventions. They almost just look like a little string. And so, they'll put guys in, also, you're in a sleep study. Of course, you got to, agree to let somebody do that to you, right? Hook you up. You're in a sleep study. You're like, whoa, what are you doing? Okay. But obviously, these people were all awake, and they were actually, masturbating, and then they're recording the data. And they also had them hooked up to their heart rate, their galvanic skin response, so like how much they were sweating. And of course, now we can also look at your brain waves, put an EEG on your head, and see what is happening physiologically in your entire body. Now, females, this was a little bit harder to capture because you can't see. So they constructed this little thing called the vaginal photoplasmograph. Looks kind of like a tampon. So it's basically a light. It's like a light meter, and it measures the blood flow through the light waves. So lo and behold, females actually have engorgement, but it's the vaginal walls and the labia. instead of the entire penis. So they quickly, are figuring all of this stuff out, and they come up with what's called the human sexual response, and found that it was universal. And universal between men and women, that was really a groundbreaking theory. They did not know that men and women progress through the same stages. Okay? So stage 1 is excitement, beginning of sexual arousal. So that's where we have that increased blood flow to the genitals. So in males, that's pretty obvious. You couldn't see it happen. In females, it's not quite as obvious. Females also tend to need a little bit more help in maybe actually having some manual stimulation, whereas men, you kind of have a two-way erection center, one straight from your brain, and the other one, the touch receptor, is actually on your genitals. So you can actually just think about sex and get aroused. You can hit the excitement stage through your brain, right? You guys know that, right? Everybody knows that. Okay? You do not have to do anything. Girls need a little bit more help. Okay? Plateau is then when we have full vasocongestion. Okay, so vasocongestion is the word for blood engorgement. So in males, it's not just a full erection, it's also their testicles will draw up really close to the body. They'll get really dark in color. Females, the labia is completely engorged in blood. And then you also have, because of the vasocongestion in the vagina, you'll have an interstitial fluid that pushes through those muscular walls. The vagina is very muscular, and that's the lubrication. So it all kind of works together for a purpose, right, to make this thing happen. And plateau then is this increased peak of arousal. Maybe call that the I'm coming feeling. Okay, so the I'm coming. And women now have good control through their thoughts. Okay? Men, maybe not quite as good control through their thoughts. So this has kind of all come after Masters and Johnson's work, that they've just learned more and more about it. And then, of course, orgasm. For males, it's the orgasm that causes the ejaculation. They are not the same thing. And you may or may not have known that. I don't know. Everybody's had an orgasm, men anyway. Females, not, it kind of depends on, your individual experience, whether you've had one or not. Most guys have, even without your own control, is nocturnal emission when you're in puberty. But the actual ejaculation is caused by the orgasm, because the orgasm is the muscular contractions in the pelvic floor. And it's the release of all those hormones from your brain, the oxytocin and the vasopressin, and it floods your entire system, causes the muscular contractions that then propel the semen out. Now, some men might be able to have what's called a dry ejaculation, so they have a dry orgasm, so they have an orgasm and no semen. And maybe they can even then have another orgasm. That's kind of rare, I think. Because your body's got all those, you've got your prostrate, and seminal vesicles and fluids ready to go, so it's probably going to come out. Females, it's also muscular contractions in the pelvic floor, and some contractions of the vaginal walls and the entire uterus. Okay, so the orgasm in males is kind of obvious. The biological purpose is to deposit the semen. For females, it's a little bit more of an enigma. Maybe it is to help draw the semen up, because you've got the contractions, but a female can get pregnant without having an orgasm, clearly. So then it's kind of like, well, why is she having an orgasm? Well, maybe it's a reward for her to encourage her to keep having sex, to try to have more babies. There's a lot of different theories as to why. Okay? Maybe it's to make them bond so that they can then raise their family together. But that still doesn't explain all the people that don't want to have babies, right? Okay. And then the fourth stage is resolution, where arousal subsides. So you then, depending on the age of the person, whether they're a male or a female, and how physically fit they are will depend on how long resolution lasts. So, if you're a very young, fit person, you get excited right away again. Okay? The older you get, the longer resolution lasts, and that's called the refractory period. Okay, so typical male response, excitement up to plateau, and like often men who are either sexually inexperienced will have a kind of short plateau, like they can't control it, or if they haven't had sex in a long time, then it's harder to control. So if you want to last longer in your plateau, maybe masturbate more. I shouldn't have to tell you that, right? Okay. Or just be in better shape, like physically. If you think about it, your brain is like pretty powerful, but if your abdominal muscles and you're just strong and in good condition and you don't smoke, oh my gosh, smoking is going to really harm your ability to stay in that period there. And then orgasm, and then pretty immediately down to resolution. Younger men may hardly notice this dip. They can get excited again right away. The older you get, it's just a part of life, guys. Now, and I'm talking like it might not be till you're like 50 though, so don't freak out. That you can maybe only have sex a couple of times in a day, or in a night, I should say, as opposed to when you were younger, you could go 3 or 4. Okay. All right. So females is a little bit more interesting. Okay. We have more variation, and actually, this was charted in 1960 from Masters and Johnson. And what the sex researchers know now is there's probably even more variability, even within a single woman. No sexual experience is exactly the same. Even the same couple, like a couple could be together for years, and they're like, "What did we do that one time?" I don't know. Didn't we do the same thing? It wasn't the same. Like, it's just absolutely, because your brain is so powerful, I think, is part of it. But okay, so let's look at number 3. Number 3 is kind of like the male pattern. But you see, it's a longer excitement phase to plateau. But then look at how long that orgasm is. I didn't say male orgasm on average about 6 seconds. Females, that's like a 30-second orgasm. Okay, so and then a steep resolution. Then we have another pattern, number 1 here, where there was a much longer plateau and then 2 large orgasms and then a slower resolution. And then pattern number 2 here, multiple sort of small orgasms, and then a really kind of gradual resolution. And if you don't have an orgasm, if you go through this whole phase here, and this goes for males or females, you've got all that vasocongestion, all that pressure, and then you haven't had any kind of release, then you may have some aching after if you don't have a release. And I read an article last year that said that, this whole thing about guys having blue balls. Okay, you've heard that before? You know what I'm talking about. You guys are all so timid. It's okay. It's like 10 times as worse in females. That's what I just read. I mean, it's kind of hard to compare because I don't know what he feels like, his body feels like inside. So how do they compare that? Well, it's probably some physiological measurements and then what people are reporting. Okay, so let's watch this little video clip of the little summary of Masters and Johnson's work. So, I mean, Masters and Johnson's work obviously was really important. It continues to be studied. We've found that there's probably more variability, but this idea of it, an orgasm is an orgasm is an orgasm. That's a pretty liberating thing, and for people to understand also that masturbation is normal and natural and can be healthy. You certainly can experience those things without having been in a relationship, right? Let's kind of segue over into some different things about sexuality. We didn't talk too much about gender. I encourage you to look through that part of the textbook on gender and gender differences, and there's different theories for forming gender. Kind of maybe first of all, what's the difference between sex and gender? Okay, the baby's born and they say it's a boy, it's a girl, but what's the difference between sex and gender? Yeah.
Well, I don't know answers, but recently there's been a lot of research on intersex
Mm-hmm.
and how people can be born with varying amounts of the male and female spectrum. There can be people born with ovotestes, which is where you have ovaries, but on the inside it's the testes. There can be men who are completely born with fertilized men, but they still have ovaries inside of them, so they have internal bleeding once they get older. There's cases where people are very rare with both functioning sexual, but I don't want to say go ahead.
Yeah, it's a very rare, intersex, so for people that don't know, intersex is the scientifically correct term for our now outdated, really don't ever use this term, hermaphrodite. That's the old, antiquated, negative, not really a good term. But a true hermaphrodite would be one testicle and one ovary, and that's incredibly rare, which is what you're talking about.
Research, they have found that 1 in every 100 kids born in America have that. So going off the statistic that there are 57.4 million children in public, private, and homeschooling. That means
She's read her stuff.
500,000 children currently have some form of intersex.
Some sort, intersex conditions are incredibly common, right? But the one having one of each gonad is very uncommon. Usually it's something has happened, so it kind of gets us to this, okay, so biological sex has some variability, but we have, your chromosomes XX, XY, but even then, you could have, that's not a definitive test either. You should take the human sexuality class. Because there's a gene, a single gene on the Y chromosome that is triggering, that's the trigger that says, okay, these two little structures inside the developing fetus are going to start to differentiate and develop into testes, or no, that SRY gene is missing, so they're going to continue to develop into ovaries. But then you have the presence of hormones that are kind of flooding the whole womb that continue to masculinize the genitals. And then the last step is hormones hitting the brain and hitting the hypothalamus. And so looking at children and individuals with intersex conditions is a good way to try to figure out what are all these different steps, what's happening prenatally, and then what does that kind of mean about maybe our sexuality for people who don't have intersex conditions. So they've learned quite a bit about it. Did you have a question?
Oh, I was...
Or a comment? Yeah.
Sex is kind of like your physical, right? Like male or female, and gender is almost like an identity.
Yeah, gender, the word gender, is really a social construction. Biological sex, we often will say, okay, so that's the chromosomes and then the organs, the reproductive organs. So biological sex versus gender is a different definition. It has different, meanings, and it comes from different sources. So, sometimes you'll have people that have a match all the way down. So your chromosomes match your genitals, match your gender identity in your brain and your gender expression. And other people will have, they'll have the chromosomes and the genitals are matching, and then there's a mismatch in that internal gender identity. And then there's a lot of variations and then a lot of fluidity on the spectrum. So there's a lot we don't know about that in particular, but I guess my point is gender and sex, biological sex, are two different things. When we study it in the brain, It's really subtle difference in what's the difference between a male brain and a female brain. I mean, they've been spending, decades slicing up these frozen brains to try to look for differences, and they find this very small difference. We do know that there's a big difference between males and females in testosterone. Maybe that's what's driving, that's what, is our motivation to seek out sex or to be sexual is testosterone. But then your hypothalamus has these different clusters of neurons that seem to actually physically look different in the male brain versus the female brain. If we had two specimens sitting here, on the table, we would not be able to tell. Okay? Is this a male brain or a female brain? And even a highly trained scientist would probably not be able to tell just with the naked eye what kind of brain it is. Okay. Okay, so that's just a little bit about kind of, how much we don't know about the brain's influence on sex and gender. But then sexual orientation, by definition, this is now who you are oriented toward in an erotic and romantic or emotional attachment, as opposed to, like other types of friendships or relationships. This is now an erotic attachment. Okay, so you actually have a desire to be sexual with this person, not just simply be friends with them. Okay, so heterosexuals are opposite sex, right? Homosexual, same sex. Bisexual, attracted to both members of your same sex and the opposite sex. And regardless of what your current relationship status is, the people that are bisexual will still self-describe as being attracted to people of the opposite sex or the same sex. And then that's kind of where your textbook stops, and they don't give any more definitions. And, sex researchers know that there is a wider variability on the spectrum than just these three categories. And people are coming up with new categories all the time. Have you heard of ambisexual before? I mean, ambisexual can be used in two different ways. Children are ambisexual in the sense that they don't have an orientation and an erotic attachment to others yet. So they're sort of non-sexual. But if you're an adult and you have sexual feelings, you could be ambisexual in the sense that you are attracted to others kind of regardless of what their biological sex or presented gender is. So you may find yourself attracted to the person, the individual, and so people will describe that as ambisexual. They may also call that pansexual. Queer might be another word that's out there that's being used, and you probably heard of some other ones too. Okay? And they've found that females tend to be a little bit more fluid in their sexuality than males are. When you look at the prevalence in the population, it's going to vary where in the world you're sampling. Okay, who are you asking? About sexual orientation, and it gets a little bit dicey in trying to figure it out. About 10% of the population is gay, lesbian, bisexual, queer. How are they measuring that? If it's self-reports, then what about all the people who aren't out? They're not getting counted, right? So, and then you go to different regions of the world or different regions of the country, you're going to get you'll see lower reportings. Is it because they don't feel safe to come out, or is it because they've all moved away? They all moved to Seattle. And so those are some of those questions are a bit unanswered. You go into any given setting, we kind of have this sort of expectation that you can expect anywhere from 3 to 10% of the population to be gay, lesbian, bisexual, or queer. And so we see that at the college here. If we were to, go down to Seattle Central Community College, which is on Capitol Hill in Seattle, we probably see a higher percentage. So it just really depends on where you are. Research studies are also a little bit dicey then in trying to figure out how to, like, if you sample a population, then how do you generalize that to the whole population? First, you have to get a really representative sample, and that can be difficult to do. So we get kind of a wide variance, but maybe 2.5% to 3% of men, and 1% to 2% of women. And then, you know, people are reporting having some kind of same-sex experience or attraction on occasion. 10% of men, 15% of women. I don't know what all the details are on where they've gotten those statistics, because if you were to take a survey and it's totally anonymous, say you're taking this survey, and it's asking you a question about like a sexual fantasy, someone might, you know, report yes. Or maybe you watched pornography with your partner and there was some, you know, kind of like maybe three-way thing in the porn, and so you had a fantasy, and so then you report yes. So it gets kind of gray area as to how much, I mean, that's a pretty different thing than someone who's had like a one-night stand with someone of the same sex, isn't it? Yeah, that's a pretty different category. So it's hard to know how they're measuring this in the research. But we definitely know that there's higher prevalence in different parts of the country, and you know, San Francisco and Seattle are a couple of the areas. So you guys read a lot of different articles and watched some video clips. Do you think it's more nature, biology, either, and that could be in the genes, that could be in the hormones, right? Biology is kind of that whole component, or more environment, things that happened after birth. This might be my only clicker question today, so make sure you ring in so they get you. I guess you're not ringing in, you're just tapping in. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Okay. Well, let's see what. So we have some, probably most people saying more biology, a few others saying more environment. 7 people are equal. 1 person totally biological, and only 2 people totally environmental. You know, I kind of doubt that anything's totally one or the other. I don't know that if that's possible. But you know, equally, it gets kind of confusing, right? So, which articles or research studies, like, which did you find most compelling, or what really made you think about this maybe in a different way, or want to ask more questions? Like it didn't answer, maybe it sort of opened up a can and then you're like, wait a second, and you had more questions. Yeah?
Well, I have questions about like the effect on the female brain. Did you know how that thing you had us read says that males that are gay have a smaller hypothalamus?
The little cluster of neurons.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so what does that mean for women that are gay? Do we not have a change in our brain? Is it just a choice for us?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. So far, most of those brain studies that found the difference in the hypothalamus were looking at male brains. And the controls, the female brains that they were comparing to, were just female brains. They didn't say what their sexual orientation was. We're kind of assuming that they were heterosexual. But so we've got kind of some evidence, and those studies, you know, from 1991, Simon LeVay did the first groundbreaking brain study and found that difference in the SCN. Then it's been repeated since then, but have we found it yet in lesbians? So that's a big question, right? Yeah?
Wouldn't it just be larger? Because they said that females have more masculine tendencies, so that part of the brain would just be larger like the male. Right? Wouldn't it just be the opposite?
Yeah, I mean, and I don't think that they've found that yet. One thing that they have found, though, that could be a little hint at some biological difference is girls with congenital adrenal hyperplasia, which is an intersex condition, where they have they're genetically a female, they have XX, but they had a douse of androgens prenatally. So they got that. So their brain was sort of surged with testosterone essentially, and their genitals. So they have sort of masculinized genitals, and usually what they call a blind vagina, where it's fused, and no womb. So those girls, when they're born, then like the parents have to decide, like, what do you do? So you have like genitals that don't look normal, and the doctor says, well, we got to, you got to name the child, and so they might do a chromosome test. But then, and so often parents will go by the chromosomes. But now they're finding that the chromosomes may not be the driving force towards gender, and maybe it's more hormonal. So those girls often grow up to be lesbians. And so that's maybe a clue that there's something hormonal. But most lesbians don't have congenital adrenal hyperplasia, right? Okay, what other studies or things you thought were compelling? Yeah.
I found it really interesting that the higher number of older brothers that a guy has increases his chance of being gay.
Okay, yeah, that was the older brother effect. Okay, did everybody understand the older brother effect? Yeah. So the more older, you would think, okay, if you followed Freudian psychology and the social learning theory, you would think having these older male models in your home would teach you to be, like a boy and act like a boy and want to like girls. But then they find actually with the more boys that the younger ones are more likely to be gay. And so the hypothesis is that there's something happening prenatally. Again, so mother's womb is remembering that testosterone and kind of builds up antibodies to block the testosterone. And just kind of an interesting little fact, more male embryos are miscarried than female. So already mother, who is XX, sees that little that little Y chromosome as an invader and kind of fights it off like bacteria and can expel it. So then I'm glad I didn't expel my boys, it's rejected, and so you have a higher percentage of miscarriages, and they can tell that. Like if a woman has a miscarriage, they will analyze the tissue, and they can come back and tell you what the gender is. Probably a woman going through that may not want to know, but because it's devastating loss. So, but they find that statistically to be more common. So maybe the mother then is sort of resisting, but she accepts the pregnancy, but then is building up antibodies that lowers the level of androgens, and androgens is that testosterone is a type of androgen, right? So you get enough androgens to develop the genitals, but then there's this final step that's not masculinizing the hypothalamus. Again, it's just a hypothesis, but they have so many numbers that it kind of makes you scratch your head because you're like, wow, like statistically, that's a lot of people. The left-handed thing, I don't really quite get that, and I don't think the scientists do either. Something about the way the brain is organized, perhaps. Don't really know. It's sort of interesting. I mean, I know plenty of families that have 3-4 boys and they're all straight. But then I can also think of a couple families where the third or fourth son is gay. So then I go, interesting.
There's 6 kids in our family, and out of the 4 boys, one of them's gay.
And is he the youngest? No.
He was the baby for a long time. Like there's a huge gap between him and my youngest brother.
Okay.
It's like 8 years.
Interesting. So it kind of falls in maybe some of the statistics. But we all know families where there's 3 brothers and they're all straight. So it's not like absolute, right? And we still don't really know why. That's just a hypothesis. Okay, what other intriguing or compelling things? What did you, anything else that either convinced you or, yeah, Kelly?
I just had a question on it. With the differing sizes of like the hypothalamus and brain, what are they studying? Like, are they studying live people or are they studying dead brains?
The Simon LeVay study in 1991, they were looking at specimens. So the people, it was all postmortem, and they sliced the brain like painstaking. It took years for them to finally, like they actually saw something that different, and then they did the comparison slides. And so we could critique that. We'd say, this is not a living brain. So, yeah, Athena?
What we found was it was just one bundle of nerves that has the exact same amount in men and women, gay or not. And it was just like a slight size difference between
Yeah.
gay and straight men.
Yeah, the INAH3,
Yeah.
only that one.
Yeah, it's just one thing was just slightly
Yeah.
different.
So would we even be able to see that on like a scan in a living brain? I mean, it would be really difficult. And then another critique could be those men all died of AIDS. Maybe the AIDS caused the brain change. So that's another critique, right? Yeah.
Didn't the guy who reproduced Simon LeVay study not use AIDS patients?
Yeah, good counter. That's right. Right, yeah.
I found it was
Swab.
the same results, but the size difference. I think Simon LeVay said 2 to 4 times larger, but the guy, he said it was just slightly larger than the actually.
And then he found a difference in the corpus callosum too. So, and it's interesting because with that study, that person really was after LeVay. Like he wanted to prove him wrong, and he was really going after it. And he said, you only used 20 brains. They were, they died of AIDS. Your controls are, blah blah blah. And then he goes and does it, and not only confirmed it, but then found other differences. So that's pretty compelling. Anybody else? Come on, guys. We've had like only a few. Yeah, go ahead.
I feel like they generalize this a lot because I feel like there's a lot of exceptions, and like they may be using like I don't know how like common this stuff is. Like they say there's a percentage of kids of after you're born, your brothers may be more likely to be gay. I don't know what the actual like where are they getting the numbers from? How many people have they screened off of this? Like, it kind of seems general. I don't know. I know a lot of people who have multiple brothers and are straight, or I know someone who's the firstborn and is gay. So
Right, exactly. And then the twin studies, same thing. You identical twins, you're 50% more likely to also be gay if one comes out, but not necessarily. It's kind of like, that goes along with a lot of things that they've found in twins, like depression or schizophrenia. I don't really want to compare homosexuality to those things, but you see that and you go, okay, you're 50% more likely to also have that. But that doesn't mean that it actually will surface because of that amazing thing, epigenetics. So this is where you go, okay, well, where's the trigger? When did, if you have the same DNA, but your epigenome is different, where did the trigger take place? Did it take place prenatally? Did it take place postnatally? Maybe we'll kind of see if there's any more questions as I kind of go through some of these other ones. I think almost any of our nature versus nurture questions in human development and in psychology, you can't isolate one from the other completely because, maybe the conditions of the womb, it's pretty isolated. But at the same time, that's still already having epigenome switches because of the conditions of the womb. So you already have an interaction between, nature and nurture if we're calling the womb an environment, right? So it's bidirectional, and then even even if somebody is starting to realize and kind of notice that they have these feelings, depending on their, where they live, what kind of, acceptance they might be faced with or not faced with, is going to depend on how they act on those feelings. Even though sexuality differences our acceptance rate has gone way up, and certainly in our part of the country, I think we're a little bit in a bubble up here in the Pacific Northwest. That if you were to travel to other parts of the country, and definitely other parts of the world, you would be blown away with, look at everything that's going on in Russia. You're like, wow, this is, why are we still talking about this? Well, clearly there's still so much discrimination, and so maybe that's why we're still talking about it. So then a lot of people have moved here to be, in a more accepting, part of the world. Nonetheless, there are still all these social and psychosocial influences. So it's a biopsychosocial process in anything in human diversity, right? So our theories, now no one mentioned anything about the BEM model, the exotic becomes erotic. Maybe we'll get to that if we have time. And sometimes I've had students who will kind of criticize me for not giving you enough stuff about environmental influences for sexual orientation. The problem is a lot of the theories that are out there have been negated, like Freud. Do we want to blast Freud and say Freud was wrong? Well, we can discredit him quite a bit in just looking at any man who was raised by a single mom negates Freudian theory, because Freud would say that man has an overbearing mother, an absentee father, and will be gay. That's essentially what Freud said. Okay, so we can probably say, okay, Freud, you were living in the 19th century, and we'll leave you there for now. Okay. Social learning theory is kind of along the same lines, and it's not really scientific. So that's the whole problem with some of those environmental theories. Is they've looked at them, we've gathered up information, and a lot of them have been either dismissed or they just haven't really gained a lot of evidence to show that this is what's going on. So that's kind of what we're talking about with the Freud's biases, and it really holds pretty little weight as far as sexual orientation, just through that very basic example that I gave. Same thing with girls. That would be like saying, if a girl didn't have a mother or a constant, female influence in her life, that she's not going to, know how to relate as a woman, and she'll have confused gender. And we know that's not true, right? Okay, so looking at gender nonconformity, then sometimes people say, oh, okay, well, maybe it's something that the parents are doing or encouraging in the child, and that's why this is happening. The thing is, it's not a reliable predictor. So if you see gender nonconformity in a child, first of all, there's probably a reason why they're attracted to those types of activities or toys or whatever it is. So then I kind of go, well, isn't that something from their natural temperament and tendencies that they're attracted to? But how the parents respond to it, it's either going to, become, it's going to either blossom and become, part of them, or if they squelch it, then they could have some internal issues going on. Or in a lot of cases, the kid will just grow out of it. You just kind of let the kid be. Just let them choose what they want to choose. So social learning theory and the gender nonconformity, even though retrospectively you can look back, a gay man may say, yeah, I kind of liked playing with, some of my sister's stuff. Retrospectively, they may say that, but that's not a solid rule. A lot of gay men, did all the sports and did all the boys stuff, but it's not fair to the child, right? Because they're ambisexual, they don't have erotic attachments yet. It's really not fair to the child to look at their behavior and go, ooh, this, and I think Leslie Stahl said that in that video. She said the gay child. I'm like, Leslie, shut up. He's not gay yet. I mean, we don't know. He's a kid, right? So it's just not fair to the child, right? But maybe in retrospect, we might see some patterns, and the developmental pathway varies, and it seems to be even more diverse for women than for men. The twin studies show pretty strong hereditary component, but then we have those differences where one twin is gay and one isn't, so then that brings that into question. They've found some genes that might be markers for sexual orientation, but they haven't identified it in lesbians, so then that brings into question, okay, so why are females so different? Why are females have so much fluidity anyway? It seems like not solid evidence. Okay? What you can kind of conclude from the genetic factors, maybe about 50 to 60% is due to genetics. So then that gets back to that it has to be some kind of biopsychosocial thing going on. And probably we just really don't know enough yet. We already talked about the older brother effect. I think it's pretty fascinating. The right-handed and the non-right-handed is very interesting to me. It must be something about the organization of the brain. I really don't know what else to conclude from that. But it does kind of explain some of the, the environments of the womb, the prenatal hormones. I don't think I shared this with you guys about looking at some of these dimorphic traits. So males and females have some, very set dimorphic traits. One of them being the luteinizing hormone surge that happens. That's what is triggering ovulation in females once you're, have hit puberty. Okay, but then they've studied gay men and found that and guys do have little surges. Remember how I said you will start to sort of, your hormones will maybe start to pattern a little bit with the females living in your house. They find that in the gay males, they do have this slightly higher luteinizing hormone surge, which is kind of interesting. And then, of course, the prenatal androgens, that's kind of with the older brother effect. And then the females that are exposed to higher levels of androgens have more typical male behavior traits. So those girls born with congenital adrenal hyperplasia, they're given a girl name, they're wearing girl clothes, they're given girl toys, and the psychologist, the researcher observes them playing, and they play like tomboys. They rough and tumble. They kind of like moving things fast. They kind of play a little bit more like boys. But a lot of girls play that way and grow up to be straight, right? We have any tomboy girls here, and I doubt you're all lesbians. I don't know. Okay, and then the INAH3, looking for this being responsible for something that has to do with sexuality. So we see these, basically what we're seeing is correlations, but we don't really understand what caused that change in the brain. Did it happen prenatally? Did it happen, when the brain was developing? Or did it happen later in life? We don't really know. So it's a non-causal, a spurious correlation. So lots of questions still being asked there. And so kind of the greater conclusion, and Schwabenhoffen's the one that you were talking about, where he found these other differences, including the corpus callosum being larger in homosexual men. So the general conclusion of those brain studies is the homosexual male brain looks kind of like a female heterosexual brain. That's kind of what you can conclude from it. And then from there, we have to go, well, what exactly does that mean? We don't know how it came about exactly, but that's the general conclusion. But then what about lesbians? That doesn't really answer that part of the question, which was one of your questions. So then let's look at another dimorphic trait, okay, before you go today. So some of the sexually dimorphic traits, scientists really don't understand why they're different. I mean, it makes sense that some things are different, like ovaries versus testes, right? That's a sexually dimorphic trait. But why, why a typical male or typical female has, so a typical female, their index finger is longer than their ring finger, and a typical male, their ring finger is longer than the index finger. There is something that happens during prenatal development with the flood of androgens. I mean, everything's about androgens during prenatal development. Yeah, so you're looking at your hand and you're going, wow, I'm a lesbian. Cool, I didn't know that. So now, okay, so girls, or you're, it might be about the same for females. The ring finger and the index finger are about the same. Guys, it might be really hard to tell. Be careful how you're holding your hand. And don't be too hard on yourself. But if you have, if any of you guys have like a super long ring finger, like you're talking, it's like bigger than every single other finger, and it's like kind of like crazy proportion difference. What that means is that you got a big dose of androgens when your mom was pregnant with you. That's basically what that means. What does that mean for sexuality? We don't really know. What we do know is that we see that opposite effect when they, so this is actually one of the only biological findings that they've found in lesbians. And again, they take a lot of samples, and the people come into the lab, and they literally will draw, have your hand on a ruler, and they'll measure, and they're looking at the digit ratio difference. Okay, so homosexual women appear, their hand will have the digit ratio hypothesis will be more like a straight man, like you got a little dose of androgens during pregnancy. You raised your hand when you were a tomboy, so maybe that's why you rough and tumble play, or maybe you just had older brothers.
No, I'm the oldest of 6, and I was raised by my dad.
Yeah, so there's all sorts of other explanations. So don't look at this and go, oh, okay. But it is about the only thing that's out there. And then we didn't talk about the exotic becomes erotic.
Oh, I like that, because when you're younger, you're not supposed to like them.
Yeah.
Even as a really little kid, I was attracted.
Yeah. The bed theory is an interesting theory, but it holds no scientific weight. It's not measurable. So that's the flaw in it. I have had homosexual students tell me that they like it, and I've had others say that they think it's the most sexist thing they've ever read in their life. Okay, see you guys later.